The courtroom was alive with murmurs and the kind of restless energy that comes when people think they already know how the day will end. At the center of it all sat a man in uniform, his shoulders squared, his posture commanding without a single word needing to be spoken. Yet to most in that room, he was just another face, another defendant, another figure caught up in a legal battle. The polished shine of his shoes, the neat press of his jacket, the faint glimmer of medals pinned on his chest, all of it was noticed, but quickly dismissed. To them, he was a soldier past his prime, someone whose authority belonged to a battlefield far removed from the halls of justice. The attorneys smirked quietly to one another, whispering under their breath. Some of the jury members leaned back, almost amused at the thought of an army general sitting under questioning like any ordinary man. They believed his uniform was more costume than symbol, a relic of respect in a place where they thought power belonged to judges, lawyers, and those who could twist words to their favor. In their eyes, the courtroom was theirs to control, and no military title could shift that balance. Even the spectators in the back carried an unspoken judgment. They craned their necks to see him better, whispering about how out of place he looked. His silence was mistaken for weakness, his calm composure for nervous restraint. It was almost as if the general was invisible, despite the years of service etched into his very stance. The arrogance of the room blinded them to the reality of who sat before them, a man who had stood on front lines, commanded thousands, and made decisions that changed the course of lives and history. Here, though, in the sterile air of the courtroom, stripped of the context of war and service, they reduced him to nothing more than a participant in their theater. The opposing counsel leaned into this perception with subtle precision. Every word was laced with undertones meant to belittle, every glance directed toward him carried a spark of superiority. They raised their voices at moments designed to jar him, to make him seem smaller, to chip away at whatever respect remained in the room for him. When he did not react, they mistook it for submission. They saw a man cornered, someone who had no choice but to play their game by their rules. This underestimation was not just in the way they treated him but in the very atmosphere of the room. Even the judge, maintaining his formal restraint, allowed a certain air of leniency to the lawyer's mocking tone, as though he too believed that the general posed no challenge. Power seemed tilted entirely to one side, and the general was assumed to be just another man caught in a system he could not influence. Yet while they whispered and underestimated, the general remained motionless, his eyes steady, his breathing measured. He was not rattled by their performance, nor shaken by the smirks cast his way. What they failed to see was the quiet strength in his silence, the patience of a man who had learned long ago that authority was not always in shouting louder but in knowing when to act. His stillness was a test, one they did not even realize they were failing. The undercurrent of arrogance spread wider as moments passed. People began to settle into the assumption that this would be another straightforward case, another display of the system's dominance over the individual. They took comfort in the belief that the man in uniform was out of his element here, that he would bow to their process, their power, and their words. They never once stopped to consider that perhaps they were not the ones in control, that perhaps their stage was about to be transformed into something they could not anticipate. The general's presence should have been enough to warn them otherwise. The history carried in his eyes, the quiet authority in his bearing, the unshakable calm in the face of their mockery, all of it should have signaled that they were misreading the situation entirely. But arrogance has a way of blinding people to the truth standing right in front of them. In that moment, they saw only what they wanted to see, a man diminished, a soldier out of place, a uniform stripped of its meaning. And so, they underestimated him completely, never realizing that their mistake was setting the stage for what was about to unfold. The laughter was soft at first, a ripple that started near the attorney's table and spread slowly, like a flame catching on dry wood. It wasn't loud enough to draw an objection from the judge, but it was clear enough to everyone in the room. The general's calm demeanor, his refusal to react, became the punchline to a private joke shared among those who thought they held the power. The opposing counsel leaned back with a smirk, his words deliberately heavy with sarcasm, testing how far he could push the silence without consequence. Each remark dripped with condescension, crafted not to challenge the case but to mock the man sitting in the witness chair. It didn't take long for others to join in, not with open laughter, but with subtle gestures of ridicule. A few members of the gallery shook their heads, amused by what they thought was a fallen figure of authority trying to look composed. One juror's lips curled into a grin as he exchanged glances with another, as though they had discovered some secret about the general that stripped away his dignity. Even the court staff, trained to remain neutral, couldn't fully mask the glances they shared. The sense of superiority grew thicker with each passing moment, feeding off the general's silence. What they failed to recognize was the weight of that silence. To them, his restraint meant weakness. To him, it was a deliberate choice. He let their arrogance hang in the air, allowed the smirks and muffled laughter to echo through the room, because he understood something they didn't, that silence can be more unsettling than any rebuttal. Yet the court mistook this quiet strength for surrender, and their laughter grew bolder, their mockery more pointed. The attorney, emboldened by the lack of objection, began asking questions not with genuine curiosity but with performative flair. Each word was laced with the intent to entertain, to paint the general as outdated, irrelevant, someone clinging to a title that held no weight within the walls of the court. He spoke louder than necessary, his tone theatrical, his pauses designed to invite more smirks from the jury. The general's history, his years of service, his leadership, all of it was reduced to the subject of a cruel performance meant to provoke laughter. But something shifted in the room as the laughter persisted. What started as amusement began to feel excessive, almost forced. The more they ridiculed, the more the general's unshakable calm became noticeable. He did not flinch, did not scowl, did not even shift in his chair. His eyes remained steady, his posture unbroken, his silence resolute. Slowly, the laughter that once filled the air began to reveal its own emptiness. It was as though the general's stillness was holding up a mirror to the room, showing them their own arrogance, their own hunger to belittle. The mockery, though still present, began to take on a different tone. Some in the jury grew uneasy with the attorney's performance, sensing that the ridicule was no longer harmless entertainment but something mean-spirited, something that crossed a line. The very silence that had seemed like weakness began to feel heavy, almost intimidating, though no one could explain why. The general's quiet defiance unsettled them in ways they couldn't articulate. Whispers started replacing laughter as unease crept into the room. People shifted in their seats, their earlier amusement fading into discomfort. The general had said nothing, had made no move, and yet his refusal to react transformed the energy of the space. The longer he remained unshaken, the more his presence seemed to dominate the courtroom. Every smirk that lingered now felt less certain, every chuckle strained, as though those mocking him were aware, on some deeper level, that they were misreading the situation. The attorney, however, pressed on, too caught up in his own arrogance to notice the change. He raised his voice again, leaned forward with exaggerated gestures, and aimed his words like weapons meant to pierce the general's composure. But still, nothing broke him. His silence became more than an act of patience, it became a quiet force, a reminder that true authority doesn't always need to be shouted. The courtroom, once alive with snickers and mockery, began to fall into a strange kind of hush, an uneasy awareness that the laughter was running out of air. And in that hush, where arrogance once thrived, the silence of the general loomed larger than ever, pressing against every corner of the room, demanding respect without a single word spoken. The silence that settled in the courtroom was heavy, stretched tight like a cord about to snap. The attorneys had done their best to maintain control of the narrative, their smirk still lingering, but the energy in the room had shifted. The general, unmoved by their taunts, finally stirred. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, dark phone. The motion was unhurried, unbothered, yet it carried with it the weight of inevitability. Every eye followed him, curiosity mixing with unease. A phone call in a courtroom was nothing unusual, people received them, ignored them, silenced them every day. But the way he held the device, the calm precision with which his thumb hovered over the screen, made it clear that this was no ordinary call. The opposing counsel tried to regain his footing with a sarcastic remark about distractions, but his voice faltered when the general ignored him completely. The man who had sat silent under their mockery now seemed to command the entire space without saying a word. The gallery leaned forward, the jury's eyes fixed on him, the judge himself shifting slightly in his seat as if unsure what would unfold. The general's composure never wavered. He simply dialed, each button press echoing in the silence like the beat of a drum. The first ring sounded faintly in the air, but it was enough to send ripples through the room. Something about the way he carried himself made people instinctively straighten in their chairs, their earlier arrogance melting into a quiet tension. The second ring came, and by then even those who had mocked him earlier were caught in the pull of his authority. He wasn't raising his voice, wasn't arguing his case, he was simply making a call. Yet it felt as though the ground beneath them had shifted. When the line clicked open, the general's tone was low, steady, and unhurried. He spoke with the calmness of someone who had made countless such calls before, each one carrying consequences far greater than anything those in the courtroom could comprehend. His words were few, precise, and direct, but their meaning was clear enough to ignite a current of unease among those listening. This was not a call to a friend or family member, not a distraction from the proceedings. It was something else entirely, something that carried with it the weight of authority they hadn't anticipated. The attorney who had mocked him earlier tried to object, stumbling through an explanation that phone calls weren't appropriate during testimony. But the objection died halfway out of his mouth when he realized no one was listening. The jury was fixated, the spectators sat frozen, and even the judge's gavel remained untouched, his eyes narrowing in curiosity rather than reprimand. The general spoke into the phone with the measured cadence of a man used to being obeyed, and those in the courtroom suddenly realized they were witnessing something they could not control. The content of the call remained a mystery to most, but the tone alone told the story. It was the tone of a commander issuing a directive, the voice of a man who knew that with a single request, gears would turn, and lives would shift. Each word was carefully chosen, delivered with the certainty of one who had never needed to repeat himself. He didn't argue, didn't explain, he instructed. And on the other end of the line, someone listened. Someone powerful enough that the general's quiet commands carried immediate weight. As the call continued, the attorney's confidence faltered entirely. He sat back in his chair, his earlier smirk replaced with something closer to unease. The jury, once entertained by the mockery, now sat still, almost reverent in their silence. The air felt charged, every person in the room sensing, even if they couldn't articulate it, that the balance of power had shifted in an instant. This wasn't about the case anymore. This was about something bigger, something that stretched beyond the walls of that courtroom. The general didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger, didn't display even the faintest flicker of emotion. Yet with each word into the phone, he dismantled the false sense of superiority that had filled the room moments before. Authority radiated from him, not in shouts or dramatic gestures, but in the quiet certainty of a man who knew his call would be answered. The courtroom, once filled with whispers and laughter, now hung on his every word, waiting, uncertain, as if the outcome of that single call would decide everything that followed. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the general's voice carried through the air, measured and unwavering, each syllable weighted with significance. Though none could hear the voice on the other end, it was clear from the way the general spoke that whoever listened was not just anyone. He wasn't requesting. He wasn't pleading. He was giving directives. The atmosphere, once thick with arrogance and mockery, now shifted into something tense, electric, and unpredictable. The attorneys who had laughed moments before tried to maintain their composure, but unease betrayed them. The one who had led the charge in mocking the general fumbled with his papers, his fingers restless, his confidence cracking under the weight of what he could not control. The jury, who only minutes ago exchanged amused glances, now sat in rigid silence, their eyes glued to the general as though waiting for the next revelation. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, his normally impassive face betraying curiosity, perhaps even concern. No one dared to interrupt. Then came the pause. The general stopped speaking, listening instead. Whatever was said to him in return caused a subtle but unmistakable shift in his expression, not of surprise, but of confirmation, as though something inevitable had just been set into motion. He gave a single nod, crisp and final, before responding with a few more clipped words, his tone unchanged, steady, commanding. To those in the room, it was clear, this was not the tone of a man at the mercy of the court. This was the tone of a man who still held command over forces far greater than anything within those four walls. The ripple began almost immediately. One of the court officers at the side door received a sudden message on his earpiece and stiffened, his posture snapping to attention without even realizing it. Another officer glanced at the general, his earlier casual demeanor shifting into unease. The gallery, filled with spectators who had come expecting entertainment, now whispered nervously, their earlier smirks erased. Something was happening, something they could not see but could feel all around them. The general's call had reached beyond the courtroom, pulling unseen strings, and now the effects were beginning to show. The attorney tried again to regain control, his voice breaking the silence. He objected loudly, claiming the call was irrelevant, disrespectful to the proceedings, even illegal. His words rang hollow. The judge did not immediately gavel him down, nor did he echo his outrage. Instead, the judge's eyes flicked back to the general, studying him with the quiet recognition that perhaps this was not an ordinary case. Perhaps the man before him carried a weight none of them had fully acknowledged. Another pause in the room, broken only by the general's calm voice as he ended the call. He did not rush. He did not explain himself. He placed the phone back into his pocket with the same deliberate composure with which he had drawn it out. The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. No one laughed. Every person in that room seemed to be waiting for something, though none could say what. And then it happened. The doors to the courtroom opened, and a pair of uniformed men stepped inside, their presence immediate and commanding. They weren't ordinary officers, they carried themselves with the same disciplined precision as the general, and their arrival was no coincidence. The whispers in the gallery grew louder, a mix of confusion and fear rippling through the crowd. The jurors shifted nervously, suddenly unsure of the very ground beneath them. The general did not look at the men who had entered. He did not need to. Their presence alone confirmed that his call had been heard, that his authority extended far beyond the reach of the courtroom. Every lawyer, every spectator, every officer in that room now understood that the man they had mocked, underestimated, and laughed at was not powerless. He was not trapped by their words, nor diminished by their arrogance. He had only needed one phone call to remind them of the truth. Shockwaves coursed through the legal team as they scrambled to regain a sense of control. Papers were shuffled, objections hastily formed, arguments whispered in desperate tones. But none of it carried weight anymore. Their earlier dominance had dissolved in an instant, stripped away not by shouting or theatrics, but by the quiet authority of a single act. The courtroom no longer belonged to them. It belonged to him. The laughter that had filled the air earlier was now a distant memory, replaced by a silence so thick it pressed against every chest in the room. Respect, reluctant, uneasy, but undeniable, began to creep in where arrogance had once reigned. For the first time since the proceedings began, everyone understood that the general was not here as a man defeated. He was here as a man who, with one call, had reminded them all of who he truly was. The silence in the courtroom grew into something almost unbearable. What had once been a space of smugness, laughter, and quiet mockery now stood frozen, every eye fixed on the general. The arrival of the uniformed men had cemented what many had refused to acknowledge: the man sitting before them was not powerless, not irrelevant, not someone to be dismissed as a relic of the past. He was a living embodiment of authority, the kind of authority that could not be challenged by clever words, theatrical objections, or the arrogance of lawyers who thought the law was the highest seat of power in the room. The shift in atmosphere was almost physical. Jurors who had smirked only moments ago now sat rigid in their seats, avoiding the general's gaze, their earlier confidence dissolving into shame. Their eyes darted nervously between one another, as if searching for reassurance, but none was to be found. The mocking glances that had once bound them together in arrogance were gone, replaced with a collective unease that settled like a shadow over the jury box. The opposing attorney, whose voice had carried the sharpest tone of ridicule, now fumbled in his attempt to recover. His words no longer had the sharp edge of control but instead wavered with uncertainty, each objection sounding more desperate than the last. He shuffled his papers, cleared his throat too often, and spoke with the strained tone of a man who realized too late that he had made a grave miscalculation. His earlier confidence had been stripped away, leaving only the hollow echo of a performance that no one believed anymore. Even the judge, who had allowed the mocking tone to carry on earlier, was not untouched by the shift. His gavel, once a symbol of ultimate control in the courtroom, now felt like a hollow prop compared to the quiet authority radiating from the man before him. He watched the general closely, no longer with detached formality but with something closer to respect, or perhaps caution. For the first time, the balance of the room did not rest with the court, the attorneys, or even the law itself. It rested with the general, whose silence and composure now held the entire space in suspension. The gallery, once alive with whispers of amusement, was now eerily subdued. Spectators sat on the edge of their seats, some wide-eyed, others glancing nervously at the doors, as though expecting more uniformed men to arrive. The shift in their posture spoke louder than any words. Where they had once leaned forward to enjoy the mockery of a man they thought powerless, they now sat stiffly, acutely aware that they had been watching not the humiliation of a relic but the quiet unfolding of authority far greater than they had imagined. Respect began to ripple through the air, not the kind that is given easily, but the kind forced upon people when they suddenly realize the weight of what stands before them. It was in the way eyes dropped to the floor, in the silence that hung heavy without anyone daring to break it, in the nervous fidgeting of hands and the shifting of feet. This was no longer the smug superiority of people in control. This was submission, subtle and reluctant, but undeniable. The general himself remained unchanged. He did not gloat, did not smirk, did not indulge in the satisfaction of watching their arrogance crumble. His stillness, his quiet restraint, only deepened the respect he commanded. Those in the room understood instinctively that this was not a man who needed to revel in victory. He had no need to prove himself to them. His authority existed regardless of their recognition, and that truth was more humbling than anything he could have said aloud. The attorney's voice finally trailed off, his arguments withering into silence as he realized no one was listening anymore. The jury's eyes never left the general. The judge's attention was fixed on him. Even the gallery, restless and uneasy, found itself watching him with a kind of awe. The shift was complete. The general had said little, done even less, yet the court now sat in the palm of his hand. Respect filled the room where laughter had been. And with it came a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement: this man was not to be mocked, not to be underestimated, and certainly not to be dismissed. His presence alone was enough to change the tone of the entire proceeding, to silence arrogance, to remind everyone that authority, true authority, needs no explanation. The weight of the moment lingered long after the general slipped his phone back into his pocket. The silence in the courtroom was no longer the silence of arrogance or anticipation, it was the silence of realization. Every person in that room understood, in their own way, that they had been wrong. They had mistaken composure for weakness, patience for submission, and silence for irrelevance. And now, faced with the undeniable reality of his authority, they were left with nothing but the bitter taste of their own misjudgment. The jury members shifted uneasily in their seats, no longer daring to exchange glances or smirks. Their earlier amusement now seemed shameful, as if they had participated in something they could never admit aloud. They avoided his gaze, staring instead at their notes or the floor, hoping to hide from the truth they had all witnessed. They had underestimated a man whose very presence should have demanded respect from the start. The uniform he wore, the posture he held, the quiet way he endured their mockery, all of it had been warnings they ignored. Now those ignored warnings echoed like thunder in their minds. The opposing attorney, who had carried himself with such bravado, found himself unable to recover. His voice lacked conviction, his words stumbled, and his arguments felt hollow. He had made the mistake of trying to strip dignity from a man who had spent his life embodying it. Now he stood exposed, his arrogance laid bare for the entire courtroom to see. The respect that had shifted toward the general left the attorney diminished, not only in authority but in credibility. The court no longer leaned toward him. His power had vanished with the first word the general had spoken into that phone. Even the judge, who had once allowed the atmosphere of mockery to go unchecked, now sat with an unmistakable air of respect. His gavel rested and used on the desk, his attention fixed fully on the man who had so effortlessly shifted the balance of the room. The judge's silence was telling. He, too, had felt the weight of the call, had recognized the authority that extended beyond the courtroom's walls. Whatever legal proceedings were at play, it was clear to everyone that they were no longer the only force shaping the outcome. The gallery, once alive with whispers and amusement, sat hushed in awe. Their earlier curiosity had been satisfied in a way none of them expected. They came to watch a spectacle, to witness a man in uniform put in his place, perhaps to laugh at the fall of someone they thought irrelevant. What they received instead was a lesson, a reminder that true authority does not fade with circumstance, that respect is not something to be stripped by ridicule. They left their seats leaning forward, tense, waiting, as though afraid to miss even the smallest gesture from the man who had changed everything with a single call. And through it all, the general remained exactly as he had been at the start, calm, unshaken, silent. He did not demand recognition, nor did he revel in their newfound respect. He had no need to. His authority was not a performance, not something he needed to prove or defend. It existed, undeniable and unshakable, regardless of their opinions. That was the true lesson: respect is not granted by others, it is carried within, revealed only when the moment demands it. The people in that courtroom would remember it. The jurors who once laughed would remember the weight of their silence. The attorney who mocked would remember the way his confidence crumbled under a single act. The judge would remember the quiet authority that overshadowed even his gavel. And the gallery would remember the moment when the room shifted, when arrogance dissolved, and respect filled its place. It was not just a courtroom story. It was a reminder that appearances deceive, that power does not always announce itself with noise and spectacle, and that underestimating the wrong person can change everything in an instant. The general had not shouted, had not argued, had not begged. He had only made a single call. And in that call lay the lesson that none of them would ever forget.